and then we'll go ahead and just jump right into our talk. So like Dara mentioned, I'm a beef cattle specialist at the University of Tennessee. My background is kind of grazing management and nutrition, so this was a little bit different of a spin for me to talk about. I'm really excited to be here, learning from you all, of course, but also talking about some of these nutritional management strategies for bulls, and kind of the big picture, how we develop young bulls, how we maintain our mature bulls, and just some of the research that has shown what we need to be doing as far as that goes. But the tricky part is, as I put this together, Saulo especially has helped me a lot, but he said, well, there's not a lot of research out there. So I was like, perfect, great. So we'll dig into what there is and go ahead and get started here. So why does this matter? Why is it important? We're talking a lot about reproduction, genetics today, marketing even, but when you can get those repro and genetics folks to admit that nutrition is important, that's a pretty big deal. And so this nutrition really feeds into a lot of that productivity that we're going to see from those bulls. And so this bull has an important job on that cow-calf operation. It has to be able to produce highly fertile sperm, and so sperm that are motile, that are correctly formed so that they can actually go in and penetrate that oocyte. It has to produce those sperm in enough quantity to be able to give that chance for that pregnancy to occur. And it also has to have the ability to efficiently and successfully deliver that sperm to the cow. So there's several different pieces here kind of moving together to be able to get that pregnancy to happen on the bull side. We also have to remember that the majority of our cows in the U.S. are going to be bred by natural service. And so we're setting this bull up to be able to deliver this sperm because we're already kind of fighting against that natural service aspect and making sure that we give them the best chance to get their job done. And so if we think about the impact that the bull has on the overall productivity of our herd, that bull is going to really produce a lot more offspring than our cows, right? And you all know that. But if we think about the impact that low fertility of a bull has, that can impact 25, 30 plus calves, or the outcome of having those calves, versus a cow who has low fertility that may impact just one calf, right? And so we want to make sure that we're setting these bulls up for success. And so that starts with trying to get that attainment of puberty. I don't know if this pointer actually works. Trying to attain puberty, early. We're going to talk about diets that get them there. And then productivity, this job that we just talked about, actually being productive in the herd. And that will lead to profitability for that cow-calf producer especially, and also the way that you develop your bulls and market them, profitability for you. And so once we get kind of that development stage out of the way, we also will talk about maintenance and how we're going to continue that productivity and profitability cycle. So let's start out by talking about developing bulls. These are going to be our young bulls that we're going to have some pre-weaning nutrition considerations, post-weaning, those bulls that are still growing, and we want those bulls to be about half of their mature body weight by 14 to 15 months of age. And so we have to think about what their weight is at weaning and what that mature weight should be and how we're going to get to that kind of 50% mark by the time they're 14 to 15 months of age. So I've got a couple of tables up here that just show us the dry matter intake requirements and the nutrient requirements of our bulls. This is going to be based on a mature weight of 1,800 pounds. And what you're looking at here first is for these growing bulls that are less than 12 months of age. So still pretty young, maybe not weaned yet. In this particular scenario, we've got 500-pound bulls, so probably not weaned yet. And when we think about feeding bulls on a commercial operation, a lot of time all those bulls are managed together. And so we have to recognize that they have very different nutrient requirements based on their body weight, based on the rate of gain that we're looking for. And so it becomes challenging for folks to manage several bulls and make sure that they're all getting the proper plan of nutrition. So a lot of times some will be overfed, some will be underfed. And so we really want to hone in on what these requirements are. And if we're developing bulls, it's a little bit easier to sort them out into groups because we have a greater number to do that with. And so in this table up here, we've got, like I said, 500-pound calves, and we've got some projected average daily gain there. And so depending on what kind of rate of gain you're looking for to get to that mature weight, you may select a higher energy or protein diet to get there. And that's really just going to depend on what your goal is as far as that body weight target by that 14 to 15 months of age. But I want to point out here that it takes a lot of energy and a lot of protein to see that increase from, let's say, 1 pound a day versus 2 pounds a day of gain, and even up to 3 pounds a day of gain. And so as you're developing or selecting that ration, you want to make sure that you're selecting something that has plenty of energy available. And I've got it up here as total digestible nutrients. You'll also see it presented as net energy for maintenance and net energy for gain. So we can balance those kind of either way. And then thinking about that increased amount of protein that's needed. And so for these young bulls, we're going to assume that they're eating about 2.25% to 2.5% of their body weight per day. And that's where we get that 11 pounds of dry matter intake for these calves. And again, you see that increasing energy need as we expect that higher average daily gain. So you've got to kind of figure out what your target is and formulate your rations based on that. So now if we switch gears to those bulls that are greater than 11 months of age, so our yearling bulls, in this particular case we have 900-pound bulls, and you'll notice that obviously that dry matter intake is correlated with that body weight. So our dry matter intake is nearly doubled here because we have nearly a double amount of that weight, body weight. But if you look at the energy and protein requirements, it's a little bit lower compared to those younger bull calves. And that's because as they get older, they're not growing as rapidly of a rate, and so they still need high energy at that kind of pre-weaning or early yearling stage, but certainly not as high as what they're going to need when they're pretty young. And so there is a little bit of research out there that kind of compares different ways to develop these bulls. And so there are two schools of thought here. There's the school of thought of I want to develop on a diet most similar to what bulls are going to be maintained on or what they're going to be put on a commercial operation. And so I may select a forage-based diet to develop my bulls so that when they go on to that commercial operation, they're going to have a similar diet there. There's also the school of thought that I want to demonstrate genetic potential, right? So I want to set all of my developing bulls on a high plane of nutrition and show the differences between these bull calves eating a high energy diet so that I can say this one, bull A is going to perform a lot better on a similar diet than bull B. And that's where our bull test rations typically come into play, and we see them developed on those high energy rations. And so the key to developing whichever system you're going to use is just making sure that your requirements for those bulls are met and that you're not under or overfeeding. And so I talk a lot about that Goldilocks zone when it comes to nutrition. So I want to make sure that we're hitting those requirements, but we're not getting those bulls too fat too quickly, and we're also not setting them back in terms of their development. And so we'll talk more about some of those impacts, especially of overfeeding here in a few minutes, but this study in particular looked at 100% forage diet, so moderate energy. They were still using something that had plenty of energy. This is not your average or below average hay, right? And then also a high energy diet that was mostly concentrate with a little bit of that roughage. And so what they found is that on these bulls that were developed on a moderate energy or 100% forage diet, they had a 52% increase in semen output for similar scrotal circumference. So even though they saw, that similar performance as far as circumference was on the high energy diet, these moderate energy bulls actually had that greater semen output. And then at 1 to 2 years of age, a 300% increase in semen output. And so we can really get that same performance or achieve good performance on a moderate energy diet and not have to have them drop down as quickly once they come off of that kind of development stage. So here was another study that looked at kind of that pre-puberty time frame. They looked at Angus and Angus Charolais cross calves for 2 to 6 months, or excuse me, between 2 and 6 months. And they looked at kind of a low, medium, and high diet here as well. So this is going to be plain of nutrition. And so all of them received free choice silage, so as much as they could eat there. A good vitamin and mineral, which we're going to talk about later, how important that mineral is. On this low plane of nutrition diet, they did not receive concentrate. On the medium, they had kind of a blend there that was 13 to 16% protein and had kind of a moderate to high energy value there. And then the high plane of nutrition, really they ramped up that 20% protein there and 1.18 megacals of that net energy for gain. So if we were to go back to those tables I showed you at the beginning, some of those plans that were going to get bulls gaining, 3 pounds a day is what this high plane of nutrition would be. And so they looked at body change, hormonal change, and age at puberty, and some of those kind of typical requirements that you would see for saying that a bull has reached that puberty point is that it has a scrotal circumference of greater than 26 centimeters. They collected semen every 2 weeks. They looked for greater than 50 million sperm per ejaculate and greater than 10% motile sperm in that ejaculate. So that was sort of their target that they were trying to reach on these diets. And so I've got a couple of figures up here. I know these are tricky for you to read probably from where you're sitting, but on the bottom of each of these figures, we've just got age in weeks. And then on the side, we have 4 different charts here. The first one is just going to be body weight, and you'll see that there are 3 lines on that chart. The top line on all of them is going to be that high plane of nutrition. That kind of middle line is our moderate plane, and that lowest line is our low plane of nutrition. So some of this is pretty obvious, but when we think about the impact that it can have sort of down the road is where this becomes really important. So for body weight here, we see a linear increase over time with those planes of nutrition, but of course that high plane of nutrition gets them to a higher body weight more quickly, which in the pre-pubertal stage is going to be encouraging them to hit that puberty quicker. But then we need to make sure that we take that into account after they've hit puberty and we go into kind of a different phase of that development or maintenance. And so what we're getting at here is we want them to grow, we want them to reach puberty, but we don't want them to get too fat too quickly. And so Dara mentioned earlier that people like to buy fat bulls. And so we see some of these that are going to have greater back fat. That top line there, you can really see it going up towards the end where they're getting a lot more fat deposited on kind of their rump and their back. And then also greater scrotal circumference on those bulls that have that higher plane of nutrition. But it's really hard to draw a distinction between whether that's adipose tissue taking up some of that scrotal circumference or just the actual, the testes themselves. And so you can see here there's also paired testicle volume. This is going to show kind of what is the capacity for that bull to create sperm. And so we see a difference there in that high plane of nutrition, but again, hard to tell if that's fat when we actually do those measurements or if it's truly mass of the testes themselves. And so what I'm getting at here is, we can achieve this same goal with different planes of nutrition, but if we continue that plane of nutrition after they hit puberty, they're going to continue to get fatter and fatter. So kind of finding that moderate area where they're reaching puberty when we want them to, but not depositing too much fat, which can negatively impact their performance down the road. So this is from that same study, basically age at puberty. Here on the side closer to me is that low plane of nutrition. Then there's the medium and the high. And you can obviously see there's a pretty clear difference in how long it takes for them to reach puberty under these different feeding plans. So on the low nutrition side, they're reaching puberty between 310 and 330 days. On that high nutrition side, they're reaching it, probably about a month earlier. And so when we think about the age that we want to start using these bulls with our heifers or our cows, we're not going to put them out there until they're probably 14 or 15 months of age. And so as long as they're reaching puberty and we have time to then get them ready for the breeding season, we don't necessarily need to have them reaching puberty at 270 days. But this just gives us options to kind of decide where we want to focus that and make sure that we're not impairing them so we don't have too low of nutrition on that development plan. All right, so to summarize that study or those couple of studies, nutrition before 7 months of age is going to have an impact on fertility, and it's especially going to impact them all the way down the line. And so we want to think about that, really focusing in on that pre-weaning and around puberty time so that we can have that good foundation. As we saw in those charts there, it affected development of gonads, the endocrine system, kind of that whole factory that makes sperm and allows that bull to get his job done. So a question that I get pretty often as the nutrition specialist is, what do I need to feed my cattle, whichever ones they're working on? And so we've got a couple of rations up here that are just examples. It's certainly hard to find a one-size-fits-all ration for any program because it really depends on what's available to you locally, what works best for your labor, for whatever is most cost-effective. And so we've got just a couple of rations here we put together that should have similar performance when they're fed with the same kind of roughage option. And so for our yearling bulls, they're typically going to be developed where they're gaining between 2.5 and 4 pounds a day. And so thinking about that, going from that development stage to the time that we put them out with cattle or with cows to breed, we want to slow down that growth a little bit. And so if they're really being developed at a high plane of nutrition, we want to step them down kind of slowly to about 2 pounds per day of gain so that we don't have any digestive upsets. We don't have a really rough transition from that high energy diet down to kind of that moderate energy. And so if we think about when we're going to turn out these bulls with the cows and heifers, we want to make sure that we give them time to adjust to that diet, but also as they're preparing to go into the breeding season, we want to give them 60 to 90 days to really make that sperm and be ready to breed cattle. And so we don't want to have these huge transitions and changes during that time that they're making sperm and getting ready to breed. And so we want to do that kind of slow step down, start adding a little bit more roughage to the diet, a little bit less of the grain concentrate mix to make sure that we're getting that transition to be a little bit easier on the rumen itself. And so we've got a couple of options here, 8 to 12 pounds of grain, whatever that grain mix is, plus good quality spring pasture, or there's kind of a general rule here of 1 to 1.5 pounds of that grain per 100 pounds of body weight if you're feeding a high quality roughage, so a conserved forage like hay. And then again, we've got a couple of sample mixes there, cracked corn, soy hulls, distillers grains, and a variety of different mixes. And these are all pretty simple, and working with your local feed dealer and getting them to develop a ration for you is probably going to be the best for you individually, rather than trying to go off of some of these very general rations up here. But they're basically just showing you that we can accomplish that same performance or similar gain with different combinations of these grains, as long as they're reaching that target TDN and crude protein in the diet. So now we'll switch gears and talk a little bit about our mature bulls. So for our mature bulls, obviously we're just trying to maintain weight, right? And we've got to think about them going into the breeding season. They're going to lose some weight, but especially the rest of the time, we don't want them getting fat, just sitting out there in the pasture, right? And so we don't have to feed them nearly as high of a concentration of energy or protein. You'll notice that, especially compared to those numbers we saw earlier, that were in the 60s and maybe even 70s for TDN, they're going to be able to get away with, high 40s, low 50s, some pretty average to maybe even low quality hay, depending on, how fibrous it is and if it's going to limit their intake. And then here they're also considering that these bulls are eating about 2%, maybe even 1.8% of their body weight. So they're getting away with a lot less just to maintain kind of what we've built there. We don't have to feed them and get them fat while they're just hanging out, especially outside of the breeding season. And so this was an interesting study that looked at what happens if we feed a really high energy diet during the time that these bulls are just being maintained, so we're not trying to get them to grow anymore, versus a maintenance diet. And they took a couple of body measurements, so body weight change, rump fat, rib fat, intramuscular fat, places they're going to deposit that extra energy that's in the diet that they don't need, especially during that maintenance period. And so you can see there are a couple of places where that's significantly different: fat over the ribs, fat over the rump, and of course, some minimal loss of weight in the maintenance compared with that several pounds of gain on that high energy diet. But where this becomes really important is how this impacted in vitro fertilization in this particular study. So what we're looking at here is the bulls on these different diets. So the gray bar is that high energy diet, the pink bar is that maintenance diet, and we're looking at the cleavage rate, the blastocyst rate, and the proportion of those things as we go across this figure. And we're looking at percentages of those, so percentage of cleavage there is going to be the sperm oocytes that are exposed to sperm and start cleavage by day 3. And so we're thinking about development of that embryo, right? And then we go to blastocysts, and so how many of those oocytes actually become a blastocyst, and then we go to that proportion of how many have gone through both of those stages, kind of how many are actually developing further into that embryo. And so while we don't see huge differences maybe between the ones that cleave and the ones that become blastocysts, if we look at that ratio, there's a pretty big difference in that high energy diet versus that maintenance diet. It's about 13 percentage points there. And so what that's telling us is we're putting this semen into the cow to try to create a pregnancy, but it's not actually as successful creating that pregnancy. And that's probably because when our bulls are on that high energy diet, they're depositing a lot of fat into their scrotum, and that's going to really impact the thermoregulation and the development of that sperm. So they're semen to put in, right? But it's not actually doing the job of creating that embryo. And so you can see a couple of pictures here where when that bull has really some excessive fat in the scrotum, and I've got it covered up there, it says causes abnormal thermoregulation like that picture, but you can see that there's going to be some heat impact. That sperm's not going to perform as well if there's a lot of fat deposition in the scrotum there. All right, so just to wrap that part up, if we look at just some overall things to take away from some of those development strategies, bulls need to be developed appropriately to reach puberty, so that's kind of our target at that early development stage, and then be ready to breed cows by the time they're about 15 months of age. So trying to figure out that sort of moderate energy, making sure that we're not setting them up to not be able to perform later, but not getting them overly fat. And that's kind of where you all are focused as you develop these bulls. And then once they go into their cow-calf operations, those bulls have to be maintained. And so figuring out what that transition looks like, figuring out kind of what it looks like between breeding season versus maintenance the rest of the year, and making sure that you're doing that in an economical way. And so how do we evaluate sort of that plan of nutrition and if it's actually working, besides some of those reproductive parameters that we can look at? If we're strictly thinking about the energy status of that animal, we can assess body condition. And so that can sort of tell us what the energy reserves of that animal are. And so this works for all classes of cattle. But I found this graphic that I thought was pretty easy to explain. I typically start with the ribs when I assess body condition. And kind of my rule of thumb is if I see 4 ribs, they're probably a body condition score of 4. and then I look kind of at other places, so the tail head, the spine, and I adjust up or down from there. And so when I go to my next slide, you'll see kind of what that adjustment looks like. But this sort of walks you through, starting with the ribs. If you see, excuse me, I've lost my spot here. I'm looking at the bottom of that page. So if those ribs are apparent, body condition is less than 5. So like I said, if you see 4 ribs, they're probably a 4. And then if those ribs are not apparent, they're probably a 5 or above. Then we go on to look at the spine. So as we look at those vertebrae across the top, if we see a lot of vertebrae, we're going to adjust down. So if we see ribs and we see vertebrae, they're probably a 3. And then we want to look at kind of this angle or curve in between their hook and their pin. So sort of their hip bones and their tail bones. And if we see that sort of smoothed over and kind of a shallow curve, then that means they have more condition. If it's a very sharp curve, if we think about a dairy cow, it's a lot lower condition. So you can see sort of the step down there. If it's pretty flat, he's a 6. And if you go down and see it start to sharpen up, it can drop down to a 3 or a 2. And so this is just another way to show that without physically looking at the animal here in front of us. But same concept here. If I look at the ribs, so that middle line, if I see ribs visible, that 4 to 5 range, and then I start looking those other places, I see the spine, I'm going to adjust down. If I don't see the spine, I'm going to adjust up. If I look at the hooks and pins again, we can adjust down if we see that sharper angle, or adjust up if it's more flat. And then of course looking at the tail head, seeing if there's patchy fat there, that's going to be an indicator that there's probably fat all over, because that's the place they're going to put fat last. And so the reason that body condition score is so important is because as they go into the breeding season, we want to make sure that they have adequate energy to be able to get through the breeding season, knowing that they're probably going to drop some condition throughout that time. And so if we have overly conditioned bulls, those that are too fat, we want to make sure that we give them time to drop some condition before we put them out, or they're not going to spend a lot of time doing their job. So if they're too fat, they're not able to get around as easily, they're not compelled to get around and go breed cows, and that's what we want them to do. And so trying to step them down, give them maybe a lower energy concentration in their diet, get them back to an appropriate body condition. And you can see that picture here. We've got body conditions from 3 up to 7, and bulls passing their BSE there. And so above a 6, there's a huge drop off in bulls that pass that BSE, and that has to go back to that thermoregulation, where if they're overly fat, they're not able to thermoregulate and create those sperm that are going to allow them to pass that breeding soundness exam. So for our yearling bulls, I mentioned they're not going to be their full body weight when they start that first breeding season, and we want them to still be gaining weight. And so it can be a little bit tricky because we're asking them to do something that's going to require a lot of energy and take away from that energy reserve, but still maintain and or gain this weight during that time. And so really paying attention to those yearling bulls. It's similar to a first calf heifer, right? She's had a calf, but she's still growing. She's not at her mature weight. And so she's got to meet a maintenance requirement, a lactation requirement, and a growth requirement. Same for these guys here. We're asking them to gain weight on top of this potential loss that they're going to see during the breeding season. And so if you have those under-conditioned bulls, increasing that energy obviously is going to help get their body condition up where it needs to be, and then making sure that we keep that transition from a development diet kind of to a high-quality forage diet as we get ready to turn them out. So during the breeding season, we have our bulls and our cows together, and so there's a limited opportunity to change nutrition here because we're not able to separate them and feed them according to kind of what they need. And so during the breeding season, we just need to monitor BCS, make sure that it's not falling completely off. And if we see that our bulls are getting too thin, we may think about, this is a bull that can't perform during my breeding season the way I want it to. And so maybe we replace those thin bulls just to make sure that we're not having bulls out there that are not really able to perform the way we want them to. And then once we get past that breeding season, so like I mentioned, they're going to lose some body condition. We've got to supplement those young bulls again. Our older bulls can be maintained on that lower kind of quality diet, and then our goal is to still maintain that 5.5 to 6.5 body condition, or at least get back up to that after that breeding season is over. All right, I'm going to wrap up here with a couple of frequently asked questions, especially kind of in the southeastern area. One that we get a lot is, can I feed whole cottonseed to my bulls? And there has been some research on that. There's also been some updated stuff on that, more recently out of Auburn and UGA, that look at this gossypol component and whether or not it's problematic in terms of reducing fertility. So kind of the original studies showed that gossypol at certain levels could be problematic in reducing fertility in males. I think that original study was done in humans, but similar impacts there in bulls. And so kind of the background here is that there are two types of cotton, and one of those types of cotton has more of this free gossypol than the other. Upland cotton is going to have less gossypol, and that's actually the cotton that we mostly grow in the U.S. And I realize you're probably not growing a lot of cotton here, maybe in this part of Kentucky, but getting some rations that have whole cottonseed can probably be pretty easy. And so kind of the first step is we understand that our cotton is not as high in gossypol as maybe what we thought, because it's this upland variety and not the Pima cotton variety. But when we think about feeding whole cottonseed just from a nutritional standpoint, not so much on the fertility side, that fat level in whole cottonseed can really impact the way that cattle can digest forage. And so if we get too much fat in the diet overall, we're going to impact their performance just from a big picture standpoint, because the fiber is not being broken down in the rumen. And so we have a sort of a limitation there anyway, and so we recommend feeding less than 0.5% of body weight of whole cottonseed, just simply for the fat content of that whole cottonseed. And so I would say if you stick at 0.5% or less, maybe on the less side if you're really concerned about the gossypol toxicity, then you're not going to run into a lot of issues with that gossypol. It's going to be higher in whole cottonseed compared to some of the cottonseed meal, and there's some various data showing that. I don't have it up here just because I didn't want to get too far off into the weeds here, but it is a consideration. But if we keep cottonseed limited to where it needs to be due to fat content, we're probably not going to run into a huge issue with that gossypol. And then another question is, do bulls require a special mineral? So mineral nutrition for bulls could be a whole different topic, but I really want to draw your attention to a couple that are very important for reproductive management and making sure that our bulls are able to produce sperm and get out there and do their job. And so zinc and copper are two of the big ones that we need to focus on and make sure that our mineral program has enough of those two trace minerals. And so one of the questions that we get, especially I think in the seed stock sector more than the cow-calf sector, is what about the value of organic or chelated minerals? So these minerals are going to be more bioavailable than what our typical mineral or inorganic minerals are. And you'll see that there was some research done that looked at motility of sperm in animals that were supplemented with an organic form, and there was an increase in motility for those that had the organic form or the chelated form of zinc and some of those other trace minerals. And so it's important to remember that passing that BSE, you need to have 30% progressive motility. Both of these thresholds, 38 and 47, were above that. And so you have to evaluate, is that chelated mineral worth the extra cost? Because it will be more costly than an inorganic. Or are my bulls already performing well enough on, my typical mineral? So that just comes down to what the economics work out to. We get asked a lot about injectable trace mineral. And so there's a product where they looked at these injections to see if it impacted sperm quality, so motility and morphology. They did see that at these 7 and 9 months, which is not exactly when we're going to be testing sperm for bulls, right? There was an improved motility and morphology, but there was no difference in the groups that passed the BSE at 12 months of age. And so the thing that I say about these injectables is if your animals in general, bulls or cows or whatever, are in a deficiency, you will see a response by using an injectable mineral. But if you're using a good mineral program, then you're probably not going to see a response because they're not in a deficient state. And so I think what happens a lot of times is people don't have a great mineral program, and then they use a product, whatever that product is, and they see an improvement, and they're like, this product is the best one because it did, it improved performance. Well, it's probably just because you have a full mineral out there, right? So some of those can get a little bit, it's more of a sales pitch, I think, but just making sure we don't have any deficiencies, we'll make sure that we have that proper performance, especially when it comes to passing those BSEs. Current evidence on overall nutrition is limited, but especially on mineral supplementation for bulls. So your state, I know Kentucky has a really good mineral recommendation publication that will have kind of what you need to look for in that basic mineral package. So just to wrap all that up, if we think about back to that development stage, low nutrition is going to set those bulls up to not perform as well. It's going to not allow them to develop from a hormonal perspective, from a scrotal circumference perspective, and we're not going to get that puberty onset as quickly as we would like. And so high nutrition is kind of where we're targeting during that pre-puberty stage, make sure they're getting to puberty, but then when we get to kind of our maintenance or fully grown bull stage, making sure they're not getting overly fat and impacting the quality of that semen. And so getting them ready for the breeding season, that 60 days ahead at least, giving them time to kind of adjust to whatever diet changes and make sure that they're not getting too much energy during that time. So with that, I hope I didn't go over time too much, but I will take any questions and I'll be here the rest of the afternoon as well.